Happy New Year, everyone. New year, new series, new material. In the online, reformed, presuppositional Van Til space, I've seen a whole lot of book studies from our favorite theologian, Van Til. Obviously, The Defense of the Faith, is the one that has been done ad nauseum. Book studies, just walking slowly through it. I think I've even seen Christian apologetics sometimes, and even Common Grace and the Gospel. But I think that my personal favorite is one that's really, really neglected, and we're going to walk through that together in however many sessions this takes us. We'll see how long this video ends up being. But the one that I want to walk through that is a much less known is this one, Christianity and Conflict. You can see that it's a spiral bound, so it's not even printed up in the same way that these are. It's just a syllabus. It's for an upper level course that was taught, or really several courses in the previous catalog. It was Christianity and Conflict 1, 2, 3, and so forth, that would have been taught as upper level apologetics courses in the seminary curriculum. But the reason that I think this one is so important, and you can get the spiral bound uh, fairly cheaply at WTS Books. If you have the Logos version of Van Til's works, it shows up in the uh, off prints and pamphlets section. You have to scroll all the way down to mimeographed studies. Thankfully, I never had to read it in microfiche format because that's just a whole nother odyssey. But if you scroll all the way down to the bottom under mimeographed studies, you can find the electronic edition of Christianity and Conflict. This is a 1995 amalgamation of several different editions of this syllabus, starting in 62, but there's also a 66 and 68, I think, and even on into the 70s. Thankfully, it didn't get updated very much. Um, but the reason that this work is so unlike all of Van Til's other corpus, and so I think useful, not that the rest of Van Til's work is unphilosophical, it certainly is, but the material here is extremely unique. Whereas in many of his other books and courses, Van Til has a tendency to repeat himself uh, rather extensively, even to the point where whole entire chapters are verbatim repeated in multiple places over and over again. I used to joke around, you can read all of Van Til by reading about 30% of Van Til. This is almost all unique material, and it really contains a close analysis of a wide variety of thinkers from the history of philosophy that is found nowhere else in Van Til's entire corpus. He did teach this class at RTS as a visiting professor in 68, and so you can also get the audio lectures if you want to listen along in Van Til's own voice. That's available for free on the Westminster Audio Archive. Um, and that was actually my own refresher as I was contemplating going into doctoral studies, and I had been out of MDiv for a few years, and I wanted to refresh myself and really wrap my head around Van Til more deeply. This was the course that I went to. It's definitely not an introductory course. It can be heavy in the sense that it is Van Til at his classically dense expression. He is not economical with his words. It's not for the theologically or philosophically uninitiated. He's going to throw terminology at you. It's just not an introductory course. But what I so deeply appreciate is that he is showing us and not telling us. It is, if you like, Van Til inductive rather than Van Til deductive. He's always, giving us concrete examples and then working out his general apologetic principles from them as he shows us along the way. Um, Whereas in Defense of the Faith, he will begin by sketching out the Christian Reformed position, and he'll give us a Christian metaphysic and an epistemology and an ethics, and then move on to the question of method. This is essentially inverting that. It is really an in-action manual where he is from the very beginning diving right in, and he's going to present. He's going to say to these, you know, philosophical interlocutors, you present your view, and I am going to immediately proceed to do an internal critique on that. And so it contains just so much of what so many readers of Van Til have complained is absent from the rest of his corpus, which is example material, concretely walking us through what this method looks like. And therefore, it is much more I think useful for that reason, where the rest of his books can be a little bit more general and sweeping and just less specificity. Now, the preface and first chapter, I think I'll probably get about 3 chapters deep today. Um, he sort of skips that over in the audio lectures, so if you do go and listen to those and you dive in and he is not starting in the same place that I am, just be aware of that. The preface and chapter 1 is not the most directly related to what comes after it, but we'll see how he connects the dots. So in this first chapter of this book, at least here in the print version, he starts off by contrasting the very much, nakedly supernatural authority claims of Christianity as being fundamentally at odds with all versions of, soft, modern, metaphorical, psychologized Christianity. This would be the kind of Christianity that you find all over TikTok and Instagram. People who are generically spiritual, they want to still have the veneer of Christianity and talk about believing in a higher power, in a God generally, but they don't really have any resemblance to Orthodox Christianity. So, in that sense, he certainly was very prescient. I won't say a prophet, but right, the Bible tells us nothing is new under the sun. Um, Christianity is not for people who are looking for a self improvement guru, right? Christianity is so much more than a manual for moral self improvements. That's the point that Van Til is making in those early pages. That those two approaches to Christianity are fundamentally at odds with one another at every level, not just superficially. And so it's really, for Van Til, futile to start with the historical evidences for why you can believe the record about Jesus contained in the Bible, and then to move someone from this kind of fuzzy spirituality over to Christianity, because you are always, in the nature of the case, playing with loaded dice when you try to do that. He uses a lot of examples taken from the late 1800s philosopher Edward Caird, who was a very famous interpreter of Immanuel Kant, and also from R.G. Collingwood. Those are just kind of his representative modern Kantian philosopher historians that he chooses to reference as kind of being a good generic example of the thought that he's trying to address. The fact that it's those two guys really is not the most important, but his big first point in those opening pages is that he is going to, first of all, expose all of this supposed sophisticated scientific neutrality of the historian when it comes to examining religious claims. And his point, if you really distill it down, is that when you play according to the terms set out by those types of thinkers, you have always let the camel's nose into the tent. And so you're better off as a Reformed Christian not even playing that game at all. All such thinkers are absolutely skeptical of supernatural truth claims. They think that you, Christian, making a supernatural truth claim is inherently circular, and that is one of the biggest intellectual no-nos that anybody could possibly ever commit. And so you might be tempted then, as a Christian, you want to be persuasive to soft pedal some of those very big supernatural authority claims to meet this non-Christian or this generically spiritual person sort of in the middle, as they say. And whenever you do that, you will quickly realize that you have de facto substituted the authority of that person for the authority of the Bible. That this person's concept of human reasoning as being authoritative and decisive in all things, that we can think about reality and constitute what we think is or isn't possible, that is actually a substitute authority to replace the authority of the Bible. And so you have already, even by moving on to this middle ground, all you've done is given up your own solid footing in the process. And so he urges us not to do that at all. And then he moves on to the second and third chapter, where he's going to back all the way up and really run us through a history of philosophy. So he started in the modern era talking about Kant and neo-Kantians, or at least people who have uncritically absorbed much of the Kantianism that is characteristic of virtually all modern thought, whether in the hard sciences or philosophy or history. And now in chapter 2, he backs up all the way into the BC era and the pre-Socratics. And he's essentially asking, although this is unspoken, he doesn't say this in so many words, it's a syllabus, right? Not a fully typed out manuscript. But he's essentially asking, how did we get here? And he's going to back up and show us how the history of human thought has led us to this point. And this would be where the audio lectures actually start. So if you're starting off with that course that again is freely available online, this chapter 2 is where you're actually going to begin. And he says, okay, well, I want to start off by talking about the Greek paideia, and he'll return to that word over and over again, not just for Greek thought, but for all different camps of thought that he's going to discuss throughout the book. And paideia is obviously a Greek word. The literal definition is something like child rearing, excuse me. So Clement will use this word when he talks about Christ leading Christians in the right way. It actually shows up in the Bible in Acts 7, 22, where it talks about Moses being trained in the culture of the Egyptians. So we could roughly translate it in the sense that Mantilla is using it as we could say it's worldview by osmosis. Thomas Kuhn would probably call it a paradigm. It is the stuff that everybody agrees upon within that worldview. And so he starts off with the Greek paideia. What he really means is he's starting off with the pre-Socratics. Those thinkers are, of course, extremely fragmented. There was an edition, a Loeb by Laxenmost, that came out in 2016 that tries to put the extant manuscripts together. And all it really goes to prove is that, the pre-Socratics are extremely badly preserved in terms of the physical texts, but of course they do get confirmed by later historians, secondary sources who quote them. And it's the same thing for Socrates, really. We get all of our Socrates through Plato, whose writings are better preserved. You will get writers like Drew Johnson, who will argue, I think somewhat persuasively, that the Old Testament should be thought of as Hebraic philosophy, so that the Greeks do not have a corner on this market. of philosophy and sophisticated thinking, and that there are parallel paideas going on in other worldviews and other cultures around that same time of the 5th century BC, that are, equally sophisticated and complex. Um, and in my own scholarship, I have argued for not direct influence from Greek philosophical thinkers in those centuries with late biblical writers, but certainly independent arrival at similar systems of unbelief. Uh, Cornelius Van Til is really famous for, and what he's going to do in this book is that he is comparing and lumping together all forms of deviation from the one true biblical worldview. And by virtue of the fact that they are deviations from that biblical standard, they go into the same bucket, as it were. And so it really is okay if they differ from one another, if the details are a little bit fuzzy, because the underlying principle is the same, that all of these systems of thought are, by definition, not Christianity. And that's what the most important thing is. So the most defining characteristics that he distills out of the pre-Socratics is that they are all of them committed to human autonomy, that we are an intellectual and rational law unto ourselves, that we are not bound over by anything outside of ourselves. They are all of them committed to a principle of irrationality that comes about through contingent individuation. Now, he doesn't mean that all of these thinkers are irrational. He doesn't even mean that they sometimes commit irrationality in their thoughts, in the sense that they occasionally make mistakes or logical lapses or errors. But he really is talking about irrationalism as an ism, as a principle, as that which is anti-rational, as this dualistic principle, rationalism versus irrationalism, that there is a component of both of these things baked into each and every one of these pre-Socratic philosophers, and also, the later ones as well. Um, so he starts off by mentioning Thales, and Thales' great contribution was in the area of metaphysical speculation. What stuff is there? We can think about the world and just what is it made of? What is there? And Thales' contribution was all is water. This is a monism that would have been inclusive of even God or the gods or whatever God concept he is working with. It's distinct from the older Greek polytheism, only insofar as it has really abstracted and metaphorized what would have been slightly more concrete in, the statues of Zeus and Poseidon and different uh, beings having domain over different areas of nature. So he says, nope, we're going to roll all of that up together. The gods, the demigods, the humans, the stuff around it, all is water. And that's all there is. Of course, if you're committed to metaphysical monism, you will very quickly end up in pantheism, because if everything is one thing, then everything is the same. There just are no distinctions. You and I are ultimately the same person. We are the same entity, and God gets included in there as well. So you and I are both all at one and the same time God, because everything is all one. And so you can see the problem, but apparently this didn't bother Thales. And of course, people make the same basic error today when they essentially equate God with reality, right? God is just a metaphor or a stand-in for whatever is real. And they don't literally believe in a transcendent spiritual being that we call God. They are just using God as a slightly less sacrilegious shorthand for the universe or nature or reality. That's what many modern thinkers mean when they say, oh, yeah, I believe in God, or that God created us, etc., etc. Well, Thales wasn't the only thinker. Then along comes Anaximander, and he has a slightly different take on things. His contribution is that actually all is indeterminate. We can't know it. It's a priori. He had this allergy to mystery and the incomprehensible. And so he said, well, we just can't really say anything about it. Everything is indeterminate. It's there's nothing more than can be said about it. It's the kind of the ultimate skepticism. Now, this is obviously not the same thing as biblical monotheism. I have met in my studies plenty of people who wanted to call themselves Christian Platonists. And I think that they did that because they are attracted to the idea of universals and they wanted to retain those in their thinking. And they thought that Plato did a pretty good job of getting us universals, that everything is not reduced to the concrete and the material. They wanted to keep that spiritual element in their philosophy, and so they think that Plato is the only way to go. And obviously, there are some things about Plato that we can't accept, so we just have to Christianize him. We have to be Christian Platonists. Well, I think that the foundation is a lot more rotted, really a lot more poisonous than that. So I don't think that that is the path that people want to go down or ought to go down. But I've met people that wanted to call themselves Christian Platonists, and that's really, they didn't mean very much more by it. Okay, so Thales says all is water. Anaximander says everything is indeterminate. Anaxagoras comes along and he says all is mind, all is abstract spirit. So you see all of these speculative thinkers are trying to get at the question, what stuff is there? And they're all coming up with entirely different and mutually exclusive answers. Everything cannot be water if it is also indeterminate. And it can't be indeterminate if it is also abstract spirit. And then Parmenides comes along. He has sort of the opposite take. He says everything is static. This would be sort of the unmoving, monostatic monotheism of something like Islam, where it's taking Christian doctrines like simplicity to their most absurd conclusions, where nothing ever changes and everything is just statically one. Heraclitus comes around and he says the exact opposite thing. He says all is flux. He famously had the quote that you can't step in the same river twice because everything is always changing. And so really what we've got among all of these thinkers is they are using similar language to try to think and speculate about what kind of stuff there may be, but they're all the time equivocating between God's intelligence and their own human intelligence as being basically the same thing. They are looking at the world and trying to interpret it, and they're saying that my thinking that I experience and participate in has to be the same exact thing as God thinking or the universe thinking, or Aristotle will later say thought thinking itself. That there is no distinction. When we think of thought, we have to always be saying the same thing. They will use terms in ways that ought to be distinguished, but they do not carefully distinguish the different senses. So they equivocate on those things. And all of them are, for that reason, entirely fundamentally non-Christian. We see Parmenides already using the law of non-contradiction in his thought, although it wouldn't be spelled out in quite so many terms until Aristotle worked out his logic some centuries after. But Parmenides is, at least insofar as he is thinking using the law of non-contradiction, and he is using it as this unavoidable law of thought as a weapon to deny the creator-creature distinction, to collapse God and the universe into one sort of something. Now, Plato comes along and he does not follow these pre-Socratics. He has a little bit more of a sophisticated idea, but he's still going to project this idea of the ideal that's just floating along out there, roughly in the same uh, status that God occupies in Christian theology. Of course, he would say that they are different, but really, in terms of function, they are the same. The place that the ideal or the intellect occupies in Plato's thought, Plato's system, is the same one occupied by God in Christianity. And he says that our thought is participation in the ideal. We are uh, thinking insofar as we are participating in this ideal spiritual thinking. Aristotle comes along after him, his student, and he takes these two poles of the ideal and the material, the spiritual, and then all of the stuff, this form matter scheme from Plato, and he puts them on now a continuum or a gradation between the two, where instead of having two separate untouching things, um, we now have a duality that is bipolar, and there is a continuous gradation between the two. Instead of being the ideal and the material scheme of Plato, we now have a dialectic of two contradictory aspects that are both simultaneously present in all things. So God is pure being at one end, and then you come all the way down the ladder and you have pure non-being at the other end, and everything else, including you and I and everything that exists, is going to be somewhere along that continuum between pure being and pure non-being, or he would say pure uh, act and pure potential, right? Possibility. Plotinus comes along around the same time as the New Testament authors and the Apostolic Fathers, and he really is a combination of the thought of uh, the pre-Socratics as well as Plato and Aristotle and their developments all rolled up into one, and he is really the culmination of all of those various threads of this Greek paideia that Van Til is seeking to address, kind of rolled up into one. Uh, and I hope that you can see that it's a fundamentally different creation concept insofar as these thinkers are willing to talk about the fact that the world was created. It's a fundamentally different concept than what Christians mean when we say that God created the world, right? If that is the God that you are converting people to in your apologetic, then you are getting people to accept a God that is not the God of the gospel. They are fundamentally different. And so Van Til would say that these apologists absorbed a whole lot of Plotinus, a whole lot of the Neoplatonic assumptions of their day. They absorbed it into their thinking. It was their paideia, and they did so uncritically, and that therefore, when they engaged in Christian apologetics and tried to convert unbelievers from their Greek paganism over to Christianity, they asked the wrong question. They asked whether Plato was sufficient, not whether Plato and Plotinus were actually fundamentally correct at square one. And so we get this system where, in their thinking, Christians are arguing that the gospel needs to supplement Greek thought rather than supplanting it. And that's how pervasive and pernicious this paideia, this worldview, this paradigm is to their thinking. And that's what Van Til is addressing in these opening chapters. It's the thing that is taken for granted in all of Hellenistic thought, and it is also the background into which Paul is preaching when he's talking to Greek Hellenists. Yeah, they may have statues of all of their polytheistic gods, but this is really the worldview, this Neoplatonic, little bit of a that's hard to say, a mixture of Aristotle and Plato rolled into one sort of semi-coherent system that Paul is speaking to. The gods have really become much more metaphorical than literal at this point, and that's just sort of the worldview that everybody uh, more or less believes. There's very little daylight, despite the fact that they would distinguish themselves between Stoics and Platonists and Aristotelians at this time, and even Epicureans, in the sense that all of them are fundamentally skeptical, and Van Til says all of them have basically been reduced to uh, a system of ethics, just figuring out what we should do and how we can elevate our ideas of right and wrong and make them universal and just live as good people. And so he goes on in the next chapter to come now to some of the early church fathers who are explicitly the first apologists. They are writing against this Greek system of thought, trying to convert Greek pagans, Hellenistic unbelievers, to Christianity. And he will address in these early chapters Clement and Ignatius and Justin. And he will get to Irenaeus and Tertullian a little bit later, but I think we'll stop at the end of chapter 3, which that's as far as he gets there. And he essentially accuses all of them of blurring some of these really, really crucial distinctions. He says, here's a quote from page 23, the apologists seek to build their own thinking upon the earlier Greek theism as though it were essentially a sound philosophical view, indicating their inability to see and properly evaluate the destructive purposes of the enemy as it camouflaged itself under the flag of theism. And so they're saying, hey, you believe in some sort of God, some sort of theistic being, some sort of higher power. That's great. Let's start there. We agree about that. Let me tell you who that God is. Let me supplement your theism with my Christianity, and we'll build a whole. And I think that it is exactly the same. Certainly, Van Til would say it's exactly the same situation as generic theism today, that it is no better than atheism, that natural theology, what you can learn about God from the world, we say, oh, well, that's true as far as it goes. But when that is your system of apologetic, you are very often oblivious to all of the philosophical smuggling that's going on down in the tunnels underneath the foundation. And it's really important that we become self-aware of how unbelieving, contradictory ideas are smuggled in to that basic philosophy. Van Til is arguing in these opening chapters that the Greek thought and modern Kantian thought or post-Kantian thought, both of them agree in that they are equally committed to humanity being the ultimate standard of what can and cannot be, that our autonomous reason, our thinking organ, is sufficient to speculate about the universe and ourselves and to arrive at ultimate reality, at least in part, without help from the Bible or revelation from square one. And that is fundamentally at odds with the Christian position. Just as a little aside here, there is a lot of ongoing debate whether and to what extent Van Til was right in some of his harsher critiques of Thomas Aquinas and Roman Catholicism in general. Some people like Carl Trueman, Moeller, Fesco, Matheson, everybody at the Davenant Institute would argue that no, Van Til does not understand Aquinas, and behind Aquinas, Aristotle. That same criticism is leveled at Scott Oliphant, as he's basically saying nothing more than the same thing that Van Til said, just extending it a little bit more precisely. And then on the other side, you have thinkers like Leonardo di Chirico, and I would even go back to the Lutheran polemicist Chemnitz, commenting on the Council of Trent, which is very fundamentally Thomistic through and through, and even the reformer Vermigli, who was himself in his day a renowned Aristotle scholar, so he should know a thing or two, and he's certainly much closer to the source material than we are. Those thinkers would be, at least on my reading, much more sympathetic to Van Til's concerns here. So when he is starting off with Greek thinkers thousands of years ago and drawing a beeline through to Immanuel Kant and saying that this fundamental Aristotelian thread is all the way through and it has infected the ground floor of all Arminian and Roman Catholic thinking. This is what he's getting at. And it's not uncontroversial, but I think that he's grasped something fundamentally accurate in my estimation. So, coming back to Christianity and conflict, someone like Justin Martyr, the first apologist, Justin would allow for anonymous Christians, that people like Socrates was actually saved insofar as he was seeking after truth on his own terms. And he famously said that all truth is God's truth. The problem is that God is not abstract. He is not impersonal reason. God is not thought thinking itself. God does not participate in reason as something outside of himself that exists alongside or outside of or up against himself. Man exercising our reason is not the criterion of truth or possibility. And so this is the fundamental thing that Justin mistakes or doesn't deal with or doesn't address. Justin, in his working with Trypho the Jew, thinks that what Trypho needs is to be shown the historical fulfillment of all of these Old Testament prophecies to which Trypho already assents. You believe the Old Testament is the Word of God. Great. Let me show you how Jesus Christ fulfills all of these prophecies that you already take authoritatively. We'll start out on all of this common ground that we agree upon, and I will lead you to Christ in that way. You simply need Christ to supplement what is already genuine and biblically grounded Old Testament Jewish faith. Cornelius Van Til contends that Trypho, insofar as he was denying Christ, is actually still an atheist. There is no such thing as Old Testament theism that is not Christian theism. And he quotes from Romans 2:29 that a Jew is one who is a Jew inwardly only. If you are not an inward Jew submitting to Christ, you are not even a true Jew in the Old Testament sense of the word. That both Jew and Greek need full Christian theism. And I think that we see that trajectory accurately borne out by all of the myriad revisionist forms of liberal and reform Judaism today that are openly atheistic and basically just philosophical. That there is a basic atheism that is present there. Phariseeism, or better we could say Sadduceeism, is nothing other than speculative moral improvement based on an arbitrary human standard. And that is what Trypho is. That's what modern Judaism is. And it is indistinguishable from this Greek paideia at so many points. So Trypho is, for Van Til, this example of what Van Til will elsewhere describe as sort of moving the goalposts. He says that the unbeliever has behind him a bottomless pit of possibility, which he's able to use to disarm the evidentiary force of every proof and every argument that you might throw at him, so long as you leave his foundation and his basic paideia, his basic fundamental philosophical assumptions about reality intact. Okay, suppose you could show Trypho that the Old Testament demonstrates that the Christ must suffer. Well, you have still not proved that Jesus of Nazareth was that Christ, have you? Maybe he's supposed to wait for another Messiah, and Jesus wasn't really the one. Because fundamentally, I still get to decide what counts as evidence and what doesn't. And so Van Til's point in these chapters is that the piecemeal approach never works. If unbelief gets to set the terms of what counts as persuasion, whether it's Greek unbelief or Jewish unbelief, if the unbeliever gets to decide what counts as persuasion, all is lost. Apologetics is a zero-sum game, and this incrementalism is fundamentally defeatist in nature. The primary takeaway that you should get out of these first 3 chapters of Christianity in Conflict, Van Til is making 2 points that are very basic to his thought. It's the non-neutrality principle and the totalizing principle, that there is no middle ground where people are genuinely curious about arriving at truth for truth's sake. That position, insofar as it makes humanity and man the criterion of truth, has already adopted not just unchristian but anti-Christian principles that are baked in, and the totalizing principle that it is about worldview versus worldview. It's not that we should argue about a few details, because if you argue about details, you will miss everything else that is going on below the ground level, and you will spin your tires and you will get nowhere. And he does this. He presents these 2 fundamental pillars, really, for Van Til in he doesn't just tell us them, but he shows us them through application to all of these different thinkers all the way through, not just the way that he does in his other books through these rather colorful metaphors. So that's what I really just value so much about this book above all of his other ones, and why I'm going to spend some time walking through it with you, people of the internet. The idea here, we'll wrap up with this. If reason and logic first get to determine what truth is, you will always have, the unbeliever will always have an escape hatch built in to that code. I hope that that makes sense. And I'll end with this quote from page 31, which I think really summarizes everything that he's been trying to do in these first couple chapters. They talk about the Logos to show the pagans that Christianity is in agreement with the best thought of our time, just as our clergy talk about evolution. This is no doubt true up to a point, but it is also true that Logos was the answer of Orthodox Catholicism to various theories which made Jesus a phantom or an emanation or a demigod, tended to rank Christ with the imaginary intermediate spirits which formed a hierarchy between the supreme God and humanity. In those 2 quotations, we're still quoting Van Til here, that confused situation with respect to the teachings of the apologists in general, and of Justin in particular is well expressed. No doubt Justin believed the Johannine Logos doctrine. No doubt he meant to set it forth as that which the Greeks should accept, but he didn't sense the fact that in the Logos doctrine, as it originated in Greek theism, as it came to full expression in Stoicism, and as it was forcibly conjoined with the wisdom of the Old Testament by Philo, the gospel according to man found its expression. Justin did not see the mutually antagonistic character of the Greek and Christian views of the Logos. Justin, to a large degree, set the example of building Christianity as a second story upon theism as a first story. That's vintage classic Van Til. We don't build blockhouse apologetics. We don't start with generic theism and add Christianity on top of it. He just hasn't told us to do that. He's showed us through working through specific thinkers how that actually applies, and that is the most effective response. And that is why this book in particular is so valuable for people who want to understand Van Til's thought. I hope that this has been useful for you, and I'll see you in the next installment as we start with probably roughly chapter 4, which should be Irenaeus and Tertullian, and go on from there. God bless.